Colorado winter, 1887. The stagecoach goes over in a storm of sleet and iron, and the woman crawls out of the wreck, one hand on a revolver, one arm wrapped around a stranger's trunk, blood soaking through her sleeve. A man rides hard out of the dark. She levels the gun at his chest. I'm not one of them. I don't know that yet. He looks at the trunk, looks at the initials on her collar, and says the three words that stop them both cold. I was expecting someone else. She lifts her eyes, doesn't flinch. Let me stay until you find her. Behind them, enemy riders are closing through the dark. This is the story of the woman who arrived in the wrong place, or exactly where she was always meant to be. Stay with me, because this one doesn't end the way you think it will. The stagecoach was already dying when Mara climbed outside. She felt it in the way the rear axle shuddered, the left wheel grinding against something that wasn't road anymore. The driver had gone quiet 10 minutes back, slumped sideways with his shoulder dark and wet, and the horses were doing what frightened horses do, running toward the only light they could see. One lantern, burning gold through the sleet, somewhere ahead. Mara braced her boots against the footboard, grabbed the reins with both hands, and pulled. The horses didn't want to listen. She didn't blame them. The road had turned to black ice, and the sleet was coming sideways now, stinging her face, soaking through her coat in seconds. Behind her, inside the coach, Lenora's trunk slid hard against the wall every time they hit a rut. She could hear it. She kept pulling anyway. The coach hit the gate post at low speed, which saved her life. It overturned slowly, like something exhausted. One corner dropped, then the other, and Mara jumped before it pinned her. She landed on her hands and knees in the frozen mud, and the impact sent pain shooting up her wrist and into her elbow. She stayed down for a moment, breathing hard. Then she got up. The trunk had broken free of the coach roof when it rolled. She found it 10 feet away. One latch sprung open, but the contents still inside. She dragged it toward the fence post and crouched beside it, listening. 3 riders, coming fast from the direction she'd traveled. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small revolver her father had given her, the year the newspaper started losing money. It held 2 shots. She'd already fired one at the men who cut the brake line. She counted down the distance between the hoofbeats and the fence post and waited. The first rider pulled up short when he saw the overturned coach. The second said something she couldn't hear. The third started moving toward her, and then a fourth set of hoofbeats came from the other direction, entirely from the ranch, and a man's voice cut through the sleet. That's my gate you're riding toward. She swung the revolver before she could think about it. The man on horseback pulled up. He was tall in the saddle, wearing a dark coat that was already soaked through. He looked at the gun, then at her, then at the 3 riders who'd come from the road. His expression didn't change much. I'm not one of them, he said. I don't know that yet. Fair enough. He didn't reach for anything. He just sat there, patient, while the sleet came down. You came in on the Durango line? Yes. Driver's hurt? She didn't answer that. The driver was past hurt, and she couldn't say it yet. One of the 3 riders called out from the road. That woman stole company property. She's wanted for questioning. The man on horseback looked at the trunk beside Mara's knee. He looked at the blood on her coat sleeve, which she hadn't noticed until right now. Then he looked at the riders again. You have a warrant? Silence. Then you're trespassing. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. This is Broken Spur Station. You come through that gate without paper. I'll treat you as armed intruders. You know the law on that. The riders didn't move for a long moment. Then the one who'd spoken wheeled his horse, and the others followed, disappearing back into the dark and the sleet. Mara lowered the revolver slowly. The man dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post. He walked toward the overturned coach without asking her permission and crouched beside the driver. She watched him put 2 fingers to the man's throat. He stayed there a moment. Then he stood. Did he say anything? He told me not to let them have the trunk, she said, and not to surrender to Vane's men. The man's jaw tightened slightly. He walked back toward her and stopped a few feet away, which she noticed. Most men didn't think about distance. Can you walk? Yes, the arm? It's fine. He looked at her arm and then looked away, which meant he didn't believe her. Bring the trunk. I'll come back for the coach. She carried the trunk herself. He didn't try to take it. The ranch house was small and warm. He'd had a fire going before she arrived, which meant he'd been expecting company. There was a cloth on the table, a lamp, trimmed and burning. 2 chairs pulled close to the hearth. Mara set the trunk down near the door and stood dripping onto the floorboards. The man hung his wet coat on a hook and turned to look at her properly for the first time in the light. She did the same to him. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a nose that had been broken at least once, and a burn scar on his left forearm where his sleeve was rolled back. His hands were rough. His eyes were steady. Cole Barlow, he said. Mara Vale. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, just enough. He looked at the trunk. She'd left it closed, but the brass latches were visible, and so were the initials pressed into the leather near the handle, LJV. He looked at Mara's coat. The initials on her inside collar read MJV. Lenora is your sister, he said. Yes. He pulled one of the chairs back from the hearth and gestured toward it. She sat because her knees were starting to shake, and she was not going to let them do that standing up. He took the other chair and sat with his forearms on his knees and his eyes on the fire. Where is she? I don't know. Mara reached into her coat and produced the telegram. She'd been carrying it for 6 days, folded small. The paper was soft at the creases by now. I received it 3 weeks ago. It says she decided to delay her journey, that she'd write when she was settled. He read it without touching it, leaning forward to see by the firelight. That's what it says on the surface, Mara said. But the spacing between words is wrong. Lenora worked in a telegraph office for 4 months before she left Missouri. She knew I'd recognize irregular pauses. She traced her finger below one line. The gap spells something else, 2 words. She let him read it. Find Barlow. He was quiet for a moment. The fire popped and settled. She was supposed to arrive tonight, he said finally. We've been corresponding for 6 months. I was going to. He stopped. He set the telegram on the table between them. I was expecting someone else. Mara had known. This was coming since she recognized his name. She'd rehearsed a dozen ways to answer it on the road west, in the cold, in the dark, when the stagecoach driver was still alive, and she still had 2 bullets. She said what she'd decided to say. Let me stay until you find her. He looked at her then. Really looked. I can work, she said. I can cook, tend the stable, repair equipment. I saw your telegraph line on the way and one of the insulators is cracked on the eastern pole. I can fix that. She kept her voice level. I'm not asking for anything that belongs to her. I'm asking for time and a roof while we figure out where she is. When she's safe, and you've sorted out whatever the 2 of you planned, I'll go. He didn't answer right away. That was fine. She wasn't going anywhere at the moment. Then hoofbeats came back up the road. More than 3 riders this time. A voice shouted from outside, carrying clear through the wall. Barlow, send out the woman and the trunk, and there's no trouble. Cole stood. He took his coat back off the hook and shrugged into it. Stay back from the windows, he said. He went to the door and opened it a foot, just enough to be heard. Anyone comes through this door without a warrant gets treated as an armed trespasser. That's Colorado law. You want to test it tonight, I'm here. A long silence, wind, sleet ticking against the glass. Then the riders moved off down the road, and Mara let out a slow breath. Cole came back inside, bolting the door. He picked up the lamp and carried it toward the trunk. May I? She nodded. He opened the latches carefully and lifted the lid. Folded on top was something ivory and soft, a wedding dress still wrapped in its travel paper. He moved it aside without a word and looked beneath it. He stopped. Mara stood and came around to see. His own handwriting looked back at them, a hand-drawn map, detailed and old, the ink faded brown with age. A rescue route, she could tell by the notations. Mine tunnels, entry points. The kind of map a guide makes when lives depend on it being right. Across the surface of it, recent and dark, was a smear of dried blood. Cole didn't move for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. She knew about the mine. Cole was already outside when Mara woke. She knew because she could hear him, boots on frozen ground moving between the stable and the fence line. She lay still for a moment in the unfinished schoolroom where she'd spread her bedroll the night before. The bridal room had a proper bed and curtains, and a quilt folded at the foot. She'd looked at it, thanked him, and asked where he kept the extra blankets. He hadn't argued. She respected that the schoolroom was bare boards and cold air, and a single window facing east. Someone had framed it out with care. The joinery was good, the sill level, but the walls were unplastered, and the floor still smelled of sawdust. She could see where he'd planned to put shelves. The marks were penciled on the studs. He'd built this for Lenora. She tried not to think about that too hard. She dressed quickly, pinned her hair, and went to find him. He was standing at the fence line with his hands on the top rail, looking out at the telegraph poles that ran toward Mercy Gap. She came up beside him and followed his gaze. Every pole she could see had been cut, clean cuts, all at the same height, about 4 feet from the ground. Not wind damage, not ice. Someone had ridden the line in the dark and worked through it deliberately. How many? She asked. Far as I can tell, all of them between here and town. His voice was flat, the way voices get when anger is being held at a distance. Took several men. Took most of the night. She studied the nearest pole. The wire had been clipped and coiled, not left to drag. Professional. Someone who knew what they were doing, or who'd hired someone who did. Vane's people, she said. Most likely. She looked back at the ranch house, then at the telegraph shed near the stable. Do you have any wire? Extra length, some, and the shed has a ground stake? He looked at her sideways. Yes. I can build a ground line connection using the fence, she said. It won't carry far, and it won't be clean, but it'll work well enough to receive messages. Maybe send short ones. She was already thinking about the configuration, the resistance of a fence line, whether the ground was frozen deep enough to affect the stake. It won't be permanent. It's not meant to be, but it beats nothing. Cole was quiet a moment. All right. She made coffee while he brought the wire out of the shed. He came back in while she was working at the stove and stood in the doorway watching her like he wasn't sure she was real yet. She handed him a cup without turning around. 7 days, he said. She turned then. That's what I can offer, he said. 7 days. I'll ask around town about Lenora. You stay here, stay off the main road, and we find out what happened. After 7 days, we reassess. She thought about it. 7 days wasn't much. It was also more than she'd had 8 hours ago. I want to keep Lenora's trunk here, she said, in the schoolroom. Fine. And I want equal say in what we do with what's inside it. He looked at her steadily. Fine. She went back to the stove. Then we have a deal. He spent most of the morning in the schoolroom with the letters she'd found in the trunk, Lenora's drafts and copies, the telegrams, the ones with the wrong spacing. Mara could hear him reading, though he made no sound. He came out once for more coffee and went back in. She didn't disturb him. She spent the morning with the fence wire. It took her 2 hours to run the ground line from the telegraph shed to the far paddock post and back. The fence wire was too thick and the resistance was terrible, but she improvised a choke coil from extra copper she found coiled in the shed, and it helped. She tightened the ground stake connection, replaced the cracked insulator she'd spotted from the road the night before, and tested the receiver. Faint, but there. A carrier tone. She adjusted the gap on the sounder and tried again. Clear. She sat back and allowed herself one moment of satisfaction before she started thinking about what the line connected to and who was on the other end. Cole came back around noon and looked at what she'd done. He didn't say anything for a long stretch. Then he said, I'll ride into Mercy Gap this afternoon. Ask about Lenora at the stage depot. The station agent will say she never arrived, probably. He checked his saddle cinch. I want to hear him say it. She thought about that. He was right. You learned things from the way people lied, not just from what they said. Be careful about Vane, she said. If he knows you're asking questions, he'll start shaping what people tell you before you get to them. Cole mounted. I've dealt with Cyrus Vane before. He said it without explaining, and she didn't ask yet. But she filed it. He was gone 4 hours. She used the time to go through the trunk properly carefully, item by item, so as not to disturb the order things had been packed. The wedding dress on top. Below it, the mind map. Below that, Lenora's books, her good blouse, her teaching certificates, and a packet of letters tied with kitchen string. The letters were the ones Lenora had received from Cole. She shouldn't read them. She knew that. She untied the string anyway, not to read the personal parts, but to look at the dates and the postmarks to see how long this had been going on and whether anything in them might explain the blood on the map. The letters were careful and honest and occasionally, unexpectedly, funny. Cole Barlow was better with words on paper than she would have guessed from looking at him. She retied the string and put them back. She was working at the table with Lenora's telegram copies when she noticed something. Lenora had a pattern. Particular words she always misspelled the same way. Particular letters she formed with a slight double stroke. The kind of habit you didn't notice unless you'd read a person's handwriting for years. 3 of the telegram copies had spelling mistakes that weren't Lenora's usual ones. Repeated transmission errors, all in the same positions. She was still staring at them when Cole came back. She heard him put his horse up, heard him come through the door, and held up one hand for silence before he could speak. He stopped. She read through the pattern twice more to be sure. Then she looked up. The station agent said she never arrived, Cole said. I know. Look at this. She spread the telegram copies on the table. Lenora didn't make these errors. They were introduced after she sent the messages. Someone at the telegraph office altered them. Cole pulled the other chair up and looked where she was pointing. Same letter substituted in the same position each time, she said. It's not random. When you line up the altered characters, they spell a phrase. She wrote it on the back of an envelope. Returned the book. He stared at it. Whoever altered these telegrams knows Lenora had a book of some kind, Mara said. Something they want back. She picked up the copies and stacked them carefully. I had a telegraph code book. Lenora borrowed it 2 years ago to study for her certification. I never asked for it back. She paused. I don't know if she brought it west. Cole leaned back in his chair. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shed door. Vane offered to help find Lenora, he said. In front of witnesses, very public, very warm. His voice was dry. He also made a point of asking whether you'd arrived safely. Did he? He already knew you were here. She'd assumed that. Still, hearing it confirmed was different. Cole reached into his coat pocket and produced a small paper bag from the company store. He set it on the table-dried beans, a tin of coffee, 2 candles. She looked at the candles and understood he'd thought about the schoolroom window. She didn't say anything about it. He didn't either. I'll take you into town tomorrow, he said. You'll need to see the telegraph office for yourself. Could expose both of us. It could. He stood and went to hang his coat. But you can't read an operator's errors from here. You need to hear him send. He was right about that, too. She stayed up late reading. At some point, Cole went to bed, and the house went quiet around her, just the fire and the wind, and the faint tick of the telegraph sounder, catching nothing but noise. She was almost asleep over her papers when she heard it. She got up slowly and went to the schoolroom window. The glass was fogged from cold. She rubbed a circle, clear boot prints in the snow beneath the window. Fresh, leading up to the sill, and then back away toward the dark beyond the paddock fence. Someone had stood outside her window long enough to leave 2 clear prints, then left without making a sound. She looked at her bedroll, looked at the windowsill. There, on the middle of the pillow, was Lenora's silver hairpin, the one shaped like a small leaf that she'd given Lenora the Christmas before their father died. Her hand wasn't steady when she picked it up. They went into Mercy Gap at first light. Mara wore Cole's heavy riding coat over her own. It was too broad in the shoulders and too long in the sleeve and smelled like horses and cold air. She pulled the collar up and kept her face angled down when they passed other riders on the road. The town announced itself with sound before she could see its stamp mills running. Freight wagons grinding on frozen mud, the particular racket of a settlement built in a hurry and kept alive by necessity. Mercy Gap filled the valley floor and crept a little way up both slopes, frame buildings and false fronts, and a church steeple that hadn't been painted yet. Church bells were ringing. Cole reined in near the freight depot and listened. "They're calling a public search," he said, "for the missing imposter." She heard it then, a man's voice from somewhere ahead, reading from paper, the words carrying on the cold air. "A woman traveling under false identity. Dangerous. Stolen property." "That's me," Mara said. "Stay close." They went to the telegraph office first. It was a narrow building wedged between the mining company's land office and a goods store. A single window faced the street. Inside, one operator sat at the sounder with his back to the door. Cole went to the counter. Mara stood slightly behind him, close enough to hear. "I need to send a message to the Durango depot," Cole said. "Status of a stage contract. Just a confirmation." The operator turned around. He was maybe 40, with ink-stained fingers and the particular squint of a man who spent his days staring at paper in dim light. His eyes moved to Mara and stayed there a beat too long before going back to Cole. "Rates posted on the board," he said. Cole paid. Dictated a short message, nothing that mattered. The operator began sending. Mara listened. She'd been listening to Morse operators her whole working life. Every one of them had a rhythm, a fingerprint, almost. How long they held a dash. The space between characters, whether they rushed their fives. This man had a slight drag on his dashes and a fast release. She'd heard that rhythm before. The altered telegrams, the ones that spelled "return the book." He was the one who'd changed Lenora's messages. She kept her expression still, and her eyes moving, reading the equipment on his bench. Second receiver to the left of the main sounder, a private line judging by the switched position. A ledger open on the corner showing transmission times. And there, partially under a stack of yellow message blanks, several strips of discarded tape. She needed to get to those strips. A girl came through the back door. 14, maybe 15, small and quick-moving, with a canvas message satchel over one shoulder and ink on her thumb. She froze when she saw Mara. Then she walked directly past the operator, dropped 2 message blanks on his bench, and on her way out brushed past Mara and kept moving. Something thin pressed into Mara's palm as she passed. She closed her fingers around it. Message strips. 3 of them, folded small. She said nothing. The girl was already out the door and down the street. Cole collected his receipt, and they left. They walked to Dr. Etta Price's surgery on the far side of the church. The sign on the door was small, and the door itself looked like it hadn't been painted in 10 years. Inside, it was warm and clean and smelled of carbolic. Etta Price was a compact woman with iron gray hair pinned back severely and eyes that assessed everything they landed on. She looked at Cole, looked at Mara, pointed at the chairs. "Shut the door," she said. Cole shut it. Etta looked at the blood-smeared map he'd brought from the trunk. She bent over it with a magnifying lens, not touching the stained surface. "Less than 2 days old," she said. "Possibly less than 1. She straightened. "Whose blood?" "We don't know," Mara said. The map was packed beneath a wedding dress. No one should have handled it recently. Etta said nothing for a moment. She put the magnifying lens down on her instrument tray. "I treated 3 men after the number 4 explosion 8 years ago," she said with her eyes on Cole. "My predecessor signed the death records. I didn't think much of it then. After he left town, I found some of his notes." She opened a cabinet behind her desk. "I've kept them. I wasn't sure why until recently." She produced a medical journal with the cover water-stained and the pages swollen. 7 men listed as dead. I have my predecessor's handwriting on one page, saying 2 of those men were breathing when they were loaded onto a company wagon. She looked between them. He never signed certificates for those two. Cole was very still. Where did the wagon go? Mara asked. Etta closed the journal. Up the mountain. Toward the number 4 shaft house. She put the journal back. I have no further record after that. They left the surgery and walked slowly toward the main street. The stamp mill noise covered conversation reasonably well. I need to look at those message strips, Mara said. She unfolded them against her palm, shielding them inside the coat. The first 2 strips were routine freight confirmations, a wage notice. The third one was different. The timestamp was 3 days ago. The transmission had originated from inside Mercy Gap, using a line code she didn't immediately recognize. She read it once. Read it again. Mara safe? Second shaft still breathes. She stopped walking. Cole stopped beside her. Lenora sent this, Mara said. 3 days ago. She was alive 3 days ago. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Second shaft. She knows about a second shaft. Cole looked at the strip without touching it. And she was asking about you, he said quietly. She was warning me, or warning both of us. Mara refolded the strip carefully. We need to find the abandoned relay hut above the mine. Her telegrams contain pole numbers. I worked it out last night. The sequence points to a route leading toward Mercy number 4. She looked at him. The hut is up there somewhere. I know where it is. His voice was careful in a way she was starting to recognize. It's above the timber line, on an unstable section. The weather's turning this afternoon. How long to get there? 2 hours, if the road holds. Then we go today. Mar. She was alive 3 days ago, she said. She's asking if I'm safe, and she knows about the shaft. If we wait, whatever she knew goes with her. He didn't argue after that. She could see him measuring it. Vane appeared from the street entrance of the mining company's land office, while they were still standing there. He was dressed well for a mining town wool overcoat, clean gloves, hat tilted against the wind. He was a large, broad-faced man with a full beard trimmed to precise edges, and a smile that arrived before his eyes warmed up. Cole, he said, pleasantly. Then his gaze moved to Mara. And this must be the young woman causing such a stir, Miss Vale, Cole said. She speaks for herself and requires no man to answer on her behalf. Vane absorbed that without losing the smile. He looked at Mara with something that might have been curiosity and was probably calculation. I imagine the journey was difficult, he said. The roads this time of year. He clasped his gloved hands together. We're concerned for your safety and for your sisters, of course. If you'd like safe passage back to Missouri Passage and funds for the trip, I can arrange that this afternoon. I'm not going to Missouri, Mara said. The matter of the stolen trunk, my sister's trunk, she said. Containing my sister's belongings, not stolen. Vane looked at her. The way people look at a problem they haven't finished solving yet. Well, he said, the offer stands. He walked away unhurried, back toward the land office. Cole turned. He was looking at Mara the way he'd looked at the repaired telegraph sounder the morning before, like he was revising something he'd assumed. You told him no in about 4 words, he said. He already knew what my answer was, she said. He just needed me to say it in front of you. They started toward the horses. Behind them, inside the telegraph office, the sounder began clicking. No operator was visible through the window. The key sat untouched on the bench. Mara heard it before Cole did. She slowed, stopped, counted the pattern. Long, short, short, long, long, short, long, long, pause, short, long, short, long, short. She stood there in the cold for a long moment, the sleet starting again off the mountain. Cole came back to her. What is it? She turned to face him. Someone just sent 3 words through an unmanned key, she said. On the telegraph sounder inside that office. She watched his face. The message said, Cole Barlow lied. She asked him about it on the trail. Not the moment they left Mercy Gap, but an hour out, when the town was behind them and the snow had started coming down in earnest, and there was nothing between them but the sound of hooves and the wind working through the pines. She'd been thinking about how to say it, and then she stopped thinking and just said it. The message called you a liar. You knew what it meant. Cole kept his eyes on the trail. Yes. Then tell me. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not. Then he pulled his horse to a slower walk and started talking. 8 years ago, he'd been the best mountain guide in the San Juans. Everyone said so. He'd taken survey crews into terrain that killed less careful men and brought them all home. When the explosion happened at Mercy Number 4, the company sent for him. He led a rescue party up the mountain using a map Vane's mine superintendent had provided. The map showed one primary rescue route, a long approach from the eastern face. Cole had his doubts, he said. The eastern face was unstable after a blast. He knew there was an older ventilation route, but it wasn't on any official chart, and he hadn't been inside it. He went with the map. The route was wrong. By the time they reached the level where the survivors should have been, the access had collapsed. 3 men in Cole's party were injured. 2 miners they'd been trying to reach died in the interim. Vane stood in front of the town 2 days later and explained that his guide had chosen the wrong path, that the official route had been clearly marked, that Barlow's decision had cost lives. Cole never found the altered map until years later, by which point Vane's version of the story had already set like concrete. You said you remembered a second entrance, Mara said. The ventilation route. You never told anyone? I told the inquiry. They said I was attempting to shift blame. He paused. I couldn't prove the map had been changed. I had no copy of the original, so I stopped talking about it, and you never went back to find the entrance yourself. No. She looked at his profile. Why not? He was quiet again, long enough this time that she heard the answer in the silence. He was afraid of what he'd find. If the ventilation route existed and led where he thought it did, it might prove Vane had lied. It might also prove something worse, that Cole had been close enough to the right answer to have found it himself and hadn't. She understood that. She didn't say so. You could have told me this before we came out here, she said. Yes, you asked me to be honest with you from the beginning. I did. Then you should have been honest with me first. He didn't argue with it. She wasn't sure whether that made it better or worse. The relay hut appeared around a bend in the trail, half buried in snow, and leaning slightly to the left, where one of its corner posts had sunk over the years. The door hung open. Mara dismounted before Cole and pushed it wider. Someone had been here recently. The signs were small, but clear food wrappings near the back wall. A folded blanket that still held warmth when she pressed her palm to it. Ash in the fire grate that hadn't fully cooled. And on the table, in the center of the room, carved into the wood with something small and sharp, was Lenora's handwriting. She knew it immediately, the particular angle of the letters. The way Lenora made her capital L with a long descending tail. Mara traced it with one finger without pressing down. It was a list of initials, 12 sets of them, arranged in 2 columns, and beside the list, 4 words, they answered me. She was here, Mara said. She made contact with someone underground. She looked at Cole. These initials. If we match them against the official death records from the explosion, I'll know some of those names, he said. He was looking at the carving with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not guilt, exactly. Something older than guilt. Dr. Etta appeared in the doorway. She'd followed them from a distance, she explained briefly, because she had something to say that she couldn't say in town. She looked at the carved initials. She pulled out a folded paper from her coat. I cross-referenced the names from my predecessor's notes, she said. Against the official company list, she spread the paper on the table. 4 of those men were never given proper death certificates. Vane's office issued summary notifications to their families. No coroner signed off. They stood around the table in the cold looking at the paper. Outside, the wind picked up. Snow ticked against the single window. Then the door darkened. Tomas Ortega filled it. He was a big man, broad through the chest, with a gray-streaked beard and hands that had worked machinery for 30 years. He looked at Cole first, then at the carved table, then at the ground. You should stop, he said. Whatever you think you're finding, you should stop. You designed part of the ventilation system, Cole said. Lenora found that in the old mine filings. Tomas didn't deny it. Then you know whether the second entrance exists, Mara said. I know a lot of things that have kept my son's family in a house with a roof. His voice was rough. Vane controls the company housing. You understand what that means? My son can't walk. His children are 8 and 10 years old. I understand, Mara said. Then understand that I am telling you to leave this alone. A shot came through the window, not aimed at any of them, or not aimed. Well, it struck the wall above the table and sent wood chips across the carved surface. Mara grabbed the carved section instinctively and shoved it into her coat, while Cole pulled Etta toward the floor. Tomas was already moving for the door. Cole pulled Mara up by the arm. Back wall. There's a shutter, she went. He was behind her. The second shot came through the door, and the lamp shattered and the room went dark, except for the gray winter light through the shutter gap. Cole assessed the routes in about 3 seconds. He pointed at 2 options left around the outer wall toward their horses, or right along the rock face toward a narrow ledge she could see through the gap. He didn't tell her which to take. He laid them out and waited. She went right. The ledge offered cover and a view of where the shots had come from. She wanted to see. He followed without question. They moved along the ledge with the rock at their backs, and the drop to the left, and the snow coming down harder now. Behind them, she could hear men reaching the hut. She could hear Tomas's voice, and then another voice, and then silence. She pressed herself against the rock face and breathed. Cole reached past her, not touching, and pointed at a formation about 40 feet below a collapsed ore shed, half buried, with enough roof remaining to cover 2 people. They made it down in stages. Inside, the wind cut off. They sat on frozen timber and listened to the sounds above thin out and eventually disappear. Cole looked at the compartment she was still holding inside her coat. She'd pulled it free from the table one-handed while the room was falling apart. You grabbed the evidence, he said. It's all we have that proves she was there. He leaned his head back against the shed wall. The second entrance, he said. I remember where it should be. Not exactly, but close. He looked at her. I'm telling you now. She listened while he described it. An old ventilation cap on the northwest face, partially covered by a rockfall, positioned above the secondary tunnel junction. He'd seen it once, from a distance, on a survey ride the year before the explosion. He'd never mapped it. Nobody had. We need that entrance, she said. If Lenora made contact with someone inside. I know they were quiet. The snow settled around the shed. When they rode back to Broken Spur Station in the late afternoon, Lenora's horse was standing outside the stable, alone. Saddle empty. Reins trailing in the snow. Tied to the saddle horn was a strip of ivory fabric, wedding veil, stained at one edge with something dark and fresh. Mara dismounted and stood in the cold holding it and didn't say anything for a long time. Cole examined the horse's hooves before he said anything. The shoes were packed with clay from a particular kind of slope high altitude, decomposed granite mixed with mineral runoff. He'd seen that clay on boots and wagon wheels before. It came from one place. The old crew trails above the number 4 shaft house, where the drainage ran orange from iron content and nothing much grew. She came through the high trail, he said. Mara looked at the sky. Cloud cover moving fast from the northwest. Snow by midday, heavy by afternoon. How long before we lose the tracks? 2 hours, maybe less. She was already tightening her horse's cinch. They rode up before the light fully settled into the valley. The trail was narrow, and the footing was bad in places ice, under a thin skim of new snow that looked solid and wasn't. Cole went first. Mara followed close without being told how. She'd grown up in Missouri river country, not mountains. But she rode like someone who understood that a horse needed to think, and that a rider's job was mostly to stay out of the way and pay attention. They found signs of a camp after 40 minutes. Flattened brush, a scrap of dark wool caught on a branch, a place where someone had knelt in the mud, and the impression hadn't frozen yet. Lenora had been resting here. And then she'd gotten up and moved on. The trail narrowed to a ledge around a granite formation, and then opened again into a wide bowl below the old shaft house. The wind hit them there, full force, nothing to break it, and Mara's horse shied left and she brought it back without fuss. Then the snow moved. Not snow. The entire uphill face of the bowl shifted, and the sound that followed was a low groan that became a roar inside 2 seconds. Cole shouted and turned his horse, and they rode hard for the tree line, but the edge of the slide caught the trail behind them, and their horses went down in a wall of white. Mara hit the slope and rolled. She stopped herself against a pine trunk and lay there while the noise finished. Quiet. She got up. Her shoulder hurt, and her left palm was scraped raw, but she was standing. Cole was 10 feet to her right, on his feet, one hand pressed to his opposite shoulder. Their horses had made the trees. Both of them, sides heaving, eyes white, but standing. The trailback was buried under 6 feet of snow. Shoulder? She said. Wrenched. It'll hold. He was scanning the bowl. The slide had come down the northeast face, not the northwest. The old ore shed she could see through the trees, 300 yards uphill, was still standing. We need to get out of the open. The shed had a roof and 3 walls, and nothing else useful except that it blocked the wind. They brought the horses inside and let them calm down. Cole worked his shoulder in circles, grimacing. Mara found pine resin on the interior wall and used her scarf to bind her scraped hand. The light was failing. "We stay the night," Cole said. It wasn't a question. She sat down on a timber beam and looked at the floor. "Tell me about the letters," she said. "Lenora's letters to you. What did she say about herself?" He was quiet a moment. Then he sat on the beam on the opposite side. She said she was a schoolteacher who wanted to go somewhere that needed one. She said she liked cold weather and disliked dishonest people, and had a sister who was more capable than anyone gave her credit for. Mara looked at him. She said that in the second letter, he said, nearly those exact words, "She never told me she'd written to you." "I know. She mentioned that too." He leaned his forearms on his knees. "She made me believe a quiet life was still a real possibility. I don't say that with regret. I say it because I hadn't believed it in a long time before she wrote." Mara stared at the far wall for a moment. "I've spent years being the one who handles things," she said. "After our father died, after the shop closed, I handled it. I handled the debt and the equipment sales, and Lenora's teacher certification fees." She stopped. "I'm good at it, handling things. What I'm less good at is believing that the handling is not the only reason people want me around." He didn't respond immediately. She hadn't expected him to. It wasn't the kind of thing that wanted a fast answer. Then, from under the floor, something struck iron. 1 beat, two beats, then a pattern. She was on her feet before she knew she'd moved. She pressed her ear toward the floorboards and listened. Morse. Slow and unpracticed, but Morse. She grabbed a loose iron hinge pin from the wall and knocked back. Silence. Then, faster this time, more certain, her name. The letters M-A-R-A. She looked at Cole. He was already pulling planks away from the floor corner where a drainage gap showed. Below it, a narrow passage drainage channel, stone-walled, barely wide enough for a person. They went down feet first. The passage ran 10 feet and opened into a chamber. Low ceiling, 2 lanterns burning low, the smell of unwashed wool and damp stone. And in the center of it, Lenora with the 2 men who looked like they hadn't seen sunlight in longer than Mara could guess. Lenora stood up and crossed the chamber in 3 steps and grabbed Mara's arms, and Mara grabbed her back, and they stood there in the bad light, just holding on. Then Lenora pulled back and looked at Cole. She looked at him clearly, without flinching. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "Later," he said. "How many people are down here?" One of the miners answered. His name was Hector. He'd been a foreman at number 4. He said there were 41 workers in the hidden shaft, rotating in shifts, guarded by 2 armed men at the main gate. Men who'd been declared dead 8 years ago, and newer men brought in on debt contracts who quickly learned they couldn't leave. Vane planned to seal the section in less than a week. The reason was simple. Outside investors were coming to survey a supposedly new silver discovery. He needed the hidden operation gone before anyone asked questions about the labor. Cole's expression went very flat and very still. Lenora turned to Mara. I found the old mine records in a county filing office. I recognized Cole's name on the rescue report. I wrote to him because I needed someone who knew that mountain. She paused. The letters were real. I want you to know that, but I chose Broken Spur Station because of the mine records. I intended to tell him everything when I arrived. Mara looked at her. I was going to ask for his help before I accepted any other arrangement, Lenora said. I want to be clear about that. She means the marriage agreement, Cole said. His voice was even. She means she hadn't decided to accept it yet. Yes, Lenora said. That's what I mean. Mara watched him absorb that. He nodded once, slowly. We have to go, he said. The ventilation route, I know where it should open. If I'm right, we can move people through it, in groups. Lenora shook her head. Some of these men can't make a long climb. Hector's knee is bad. 2 others are worse. She looked at Mara. We need outside help before we move anyone. Mara was already thinking through the telegraph problem. The private line in Vane's office. The transmission schedules. June stolen message strips. The code book, she said. Where is it? Lenora hesitated 1 second. I hid it inside the hollow battery casing in Cole's schoolroom. Cole stared at her. You've been to Broken Spur Station. Before Vane's men reached the road, she looked between them. I needed somewhere safe. I needed it to be somewhere only Mara would think to look. From somewhere above them, stone scraped against stone. Someone was sealing the drainage passage. Cole moved toward it immediately. They were already losing their way out. They smelled the smoke before they saw the flames. Mara was riding ahead when it hit her, not wood smoke, not a cooking fire. Something heavier. Wet hay burning, which takes longer to catch and burns meaner once it does. She kicked her horse into a gallop and came around the last bend above Broken Spur Station, with Cole right behind her. The hay barn was fully involved. Orange light against the dark, sparks lifting off the roof in columns and drifting toward the stable. The stable doors were chained shut from the outside. She could hear the horses. She was off her horse before it fully stopped, and Cole was already at the stable door with a rock from the fence line, hammering at the chain loop where it met the hinge. She got to the other hinge, and they worked from both sides, and the door gave inward, and the horses came out in a rush, 4 of them, pushing past, eyes wild, scattering into the paddock and the open pasture beyond. Cole caught 2. Mara caught 1. The 4th ran for the tree line and stopped when it hit the fence. They stood in the cold, watching the hay barn finish burning. There was nothing to be done about it. The structure was gone. Cole had lost his winter feed, the barn itself, and the small forge shed that shared the back wall. He stood with his arms at his sides and watched it burn. Mara went to the schoolroom. The floor near the far corner had been pried up. 2 boards pulled free, leaning against the wall. She crouched down and felt inside the space beneath. The hollow battery casing was still there, pushed into the far corner, covered with the sleeve of an old coat. She worked it free and opened the casing. The code book was inside, intact, but there were pages missing. She could see where they'd been taken clean pulls, along the spine, not tears. Someone had known exactly what they wanted. She was still sitting on the schoolroom floor with the casing in her lap when she heard horses outside. More than 2. She put the casing inside her coat and went to the door. Cyrus Vane rode into the yard with Sheriff Boone Maddox beside him and 3 riders behind. Vane looked at the burning barn without visible surprise. Boone looked at it with his mouth pressed flat. Cole stood in the center of the yard. Vane produced papers from his coat. He offered them to Boone, who took them and read them, and looked at Cole. Warrant for Lenora Vale, Boone said. Theft and sabotage. Federal authorization, sent through the Durango office this morning. She's not here, Cole said. The warrant authorizes a search of the property. Then search it. Cole didn't move. You won't find her. Mara came out of the schoolroom and walked across the yard. She kept her coat closed and her pace steady. She looked at the warrant in Boone's hand as she passed close enough to read it. The transmission code in the upper corner was wrong. Federal authorizations used a specific relay sequence. She'd processed them herself at the railway office. This one had the sequence reversed. She looked at Boone. He was reading it again, frowning slightly. That authorization was altered, she said. Boone looked at her, then at the paper. Vane's expression didn't change. The woman is not a telegraph authority. No, Mara said, but I ran federal wire traffic for 3 years, and I know the relay codes. That sequence reads backward. Someone changed it after the original transmission. Boone folded the warrant slowly. I'll need to verify this through the Durango office directly, he said to Vane. I won't act on paperwork I can't confirm. Vane accepted that with the patience of a man who had other arrangements in place. Lenora walked out from behind the stable. Cole turned. Mara turned. Lenora had brushed the mine dust from her coat and pinned her hair back, and she walked across the yard like she was walking into a classroom. I'll go with Sheriff Maddox, she said, voluntarily, to prevent further damage to this property. She looked at Cole. This isn't your fault. Cole said nothing. His jaw was tight. It's not a concession, Lenora said lower. It's a tactic. Let me use it. Boone took Lenora toward town with 2 of the riders. Vane lingered. He looked at Mara with the particular attention of someone who has already decided the next move and is merely waiting for the board to clear. Miss Vale, he said. The offer I made in town stands. Passage east. Traveling money. Complete safety. He glanced at the burned barn. I think it's clear that remaining here carries considerable cost. Cole stepped forward slightly. Not in front of Mara, beside her. She'll answer for herself, he said. Mara looked at Vane. I'm not going to Missouri. Vane nodded once, like he'd expected it. He rode out with his remaining men, and the yard went quiet except for the crackle of the dying barn. Cole stood there, looking at nothing in particular. Your relay contract, Mara said. Canceled this morning. Vane's office sent word before they came here. He said it without heat, just a fact being put down where she could see it. The neighboring ranchers got notices too. Anyone who supplies me or accepts work from me loses their freight access. She absorbed that. The man had just cut Cole's income, burned his feed, and isolated him from his neighbors in one afternoon, and all of it was legal. All of it looked like business. The missing codebook pages, she said. June told us the private line runs midnight to 2. If those pages contain the transmission schedule, they do. He turned to look at her. There's a route out for you, tonight. June knows a ridge path that connects to the independent railway line. You could be in Durango by morning. Mara looked at him. I'm telling you, because you should know it exists, he said. Not because I'm asking you to take it, Cole. The contract's gone, the barn's gone. Lenora's in custody. Everything I offered you when you arrived here is reduced. Reduced, she repeated. I can't protect you the same way. I want you to know that, honestly. She came around, so she was facing him directly. Staying is my decision, she said. It's not a favor you grant me, and it's not a sacrifice you get to prevent. I'm choosing to stay because the captive workers deserve someone who can use that private line, and because leaving would mean abandoning the only life I've started to want in longer than I can remember. She held his gaze. Stop deciding what's safe for me without asking what I want. He was quiet. The burned barn ticked and settled behind them. The thought of you leaving, he said, finally quietly. It frightens me more than losing the ranch. She heard that. She let it sit. Then give me the full ventilation map, she said. All of it. No more held pieces. He went inside and came back with a complete map, his own hand-drawn copy, every notation, the location of the forgotten cap on the northwest face, the tunnel junction depths. He put it in her hands without conditions. That night at midnight, the private line came alive. Mara sat at the sounder in the telegraph shed, with the lamp turned low, and listened. The transmission was short, routine on the surface supply orders, a weather report. But embedded in the timing gaps, Using the schedule from the missing codebook pages she'd memorized before the pages were taken was something else. She wrote it out on paper and read it twice to be sure. She took it inside and woke Cole. He read it. They looked at each other in the lamplight. The hidden mine would be sealed in 48 hours. Every worker still inside. Mara's plan was simple. The private line transmitted between midnight and 2. She needed to reach Vane's telegraph equipment, splice into the outgoing relay, and push a single long transmission through to the independent railway junction before anyone could cut it. Cole's plan was simpler. She was not going into that building alone. They argued about it at the kitchen table while the fire burned low. "You can watch the exterior," she said. "If someone comes, you signal me. And if someone comes through the back while I'm watching the front, then I deal with it." "Mara, you do this every time fear takes over," she said. "You stop thinking about what's practical and start thinking about what you can control. Those are different problems." He sat back. The lamp between them lit his face unevenly. "You're right," he said. "I do. And I'm asking you to let me do something about it this time, instead of just acknowledging it. There's a difference between watching my back and making my decisions. I know the difference. Do you?" She put her pen down. "Because from where I sit, it looks the same." He was quiet. She pressed forward before the silence could settle into something immovable. "I found the message 3 nights ago," she said. "The one I didn't tell you about." He looked at her. She folded her hands on the table. "Before I left Missouri, there was an unfinished transmission at the railway office, came in partial, never completed. I pulled it because I recognized Lenora's timing." She paused. "It said she'd chosen Broken Spur Station because the old mine records put your name on the rescue report. She needed your knowledge of the mountain. She intended to ask for it directly after arriving." Cole didn't move. "She wrote it before she'd decided about the marriage," Mara said. "The transmission was from her first week after leaving Missouri, before most of the letters between you." She watched his face. "I hid it because I was afraid you'd stop helping if you knew." "You were right to be afraid of that," he said. His voice was very even. "I know. Both of you came here because of what I know about the mine. Lenora for the records. You to find Lenora." "Yes." The fire shifted. A log dropped and sent sparks up the flue. "Were any of her letters real?" he asked. "The later ones were," Mara said. "I read them. The ink changes. The tone changes. The woman writing in October is not the same woman who started writing in June. She was afraid and using you as a resource in June. By October, she was telling you things she didn't need to tell you. She kept her voice level. Whether that matters is your decision." Cole stood. He went to the window and stood with his back to her. "I no longer care why she first wrote," he said. "I stopped caring somewhere. Around the 3rd week, you were here." He turned. "Lenora is not the woman whose presence has changed this house." Mara stood up. "Then what do you want?" she said, clearly, without the fear underneath it. He crossed the space between them and kissed her. It was brief and careful, and completely honest, no performance in it, no attempt to overwhelm. His hand came up to the side of her face, and she felt the roughness of his palm, and the slight tremor in it, and she let it happen, let herself be present in it for the space of a few seconds. Then she stepped back. "That's not enough," she said. Her voice was steady. "I need more than a moment you can take back in the morning when the fear returns. I know then. Tell me plainly what you want when you're not terrified." He opened his mouth, closed it. The words were there. She could see them, but fear sat on top of them like a stone, and he couldn't move it. "Not yet," she picked up her coat. "Then help me get into that building." June met them behind the church, with a route she'd been mapping for 3 weeks over the livery roof, across the gap to the land office, down into the alley behind the telegraph building. The maintenance hatch on the roof was locked with a simple padlock that Mara had a wire for. She was inside in 4 minutes. The main operator was gone. The primary sounder sat dark. The private line equipment was in the back room, behind a locked cabinet that she opened with a bent filing pin while June kept watch from the roof hatch. She found the relay connection, spliced into it with a portable key from her kit. Began transmitting. Names first, the 41 workers in the hidden shaft, the ones Lenora and Hector had given her. She transmitted them slowly, clearly, with the relay code for emergency public record. The signal would hit the independent railway junction and bounce to every connected office within range. She was 12 names in when the external line went dead. Someone had cut the relay. She switched to the secondary coil, the one connected to Vane's private line rather than the public junction, and kept sending. Different path. Slower. But it was live. She was at name 37 when the back door opened. She didn't stop sending. 4 more names. Then the last, the hand that grabbed her shoulder, pulled her back hard from the bench. Below in the street, she heard Cole's voice raised in argument. He'd been covering the exterior. He'd been watching, and then a shot, and then nothing. She was in the freight yard before she could see anything clearly. Her wrists bound in front of her, 2 of Vane's guards moving her toward the ore wagons. The train of wagons was already moving, lanterns swinging on the tailgates, headed toward the mountain tunnel. She turned to look back. Cole was in the freight yard entrance. Standing, she could see him clearly in the lamplight, upright, not down. She pulled in a breath. Then she saw the dark patch spreading across his right side. A guard pushed her up into the last wagon, and the canvas dropped. Beside her in the dark, a familiar hand found hers. Lenora. The wagon rolled into the tunnel mouth, and the light outside disappeared. She woke to the sound of dripping water and the smell of blasting powder. The chamber was low-ceilinged and lamp-lit, carved out of the mountain's bones rather than built. Around her, 41 people sat or lay on flattened ore sacks. Some of them had been here 8 years. She could tell by their eyes a particular patience that comes not from peace, but from surviving long enough that panic stops being useful. Lenora was beside her, awake, watching the single guard near the main gate. Vane came in an hour later. He came alone, which told her he wasn't afraid of them. That was either confidence or contempt. With men like Vane, it was usually both. He stood in the center of the chamber and looked at Mara the way an engineer looks at a problem he's already solved on paper. "The codebook," he said, "specifically the relay schedules. Where are they hidden in Barlow's house?" She looked at him, the hollow battery casing in the schoolroom floor. Under the left board, third from the wall, he waited. "That's where I moved it, after your men pulled the boards up wrong," she said. The casing was in the corner nearest the window. They looked in the corner nearest the door. She was lying. The lie needed to be specific enough to be believable and vague enough to buy time. Specific location, plausible detail, the slight condescension of someone correcting an incompetent search. Men like Vane responded to being told their employees had failed. "You have until dawn," he said. Then he left. Lenora leaned close. "He'll send men to Broken Spur." "I know, it sends them away from here." Mara was already looking at the walls, specifically at the iron pipes that ran along the upper edge of the far wall, ventilation pipes, old, running from the chamber toward the northwest face. She'd seen the same configuration on old mine schematics. "Those pipes, where do they exit, Hector?" The foreman was awake nearby. He'd been listening. "Northwest cap," he said, above the old rescue entrance. But the cap was sealed after the explosion. Sealed with what? Iron plate, bolted from outside. Can't be unbolted from inside. No. Mara sat with that for a moment. Then she pulled a flat-headed bolt from the bench beside her, the kind used on ore cart hitches, scattered across the floor everywhere down here, and struck it against the pipe. The sound traveled, clean and clear and far. She did it again, this time in pattern. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. She waited. Nothing. She tried a different pattern. A number 7 in Morse. Then a pause. Then the letter H. For Hector, for human, for here. She handed the bolt to Hector. "Teach 3 of the strongest workers this pattern," she said. "Take turns every 5 minutes, don't stop." She spent the next hour organizing the chamber. She didn't ask permission, and she didn't explain everything at once. She identified which workers could walk unassisted, which ones needed support, which two couldn't be moved without a stretcher. She matched the walkers with the injured in pairs. She had the workers near the far wall pull ore sacks into a line that could become a stretcher if they tied the handles together. She moved quietly. The guard near the main gate watched her, but didn't intervene. Vane had told him to keep them inside, not to keep them still. Lenora organized the food, 2 days of rations. She estimated if they stretched it. She distributed water evenly without being asked to account for it. The two sisters worked without discussing the plan aloud, which was itself a kind of communication built over 32 years. At some point, Mara became aware that the workers were watching her differently, not with hope exactly. Hope was too fragile a word for people who'd been underground this long. It was more like attention. The specific attention of people who have learned that most visitors to their situation eventually leave, but who are watching to see whether this one might be different. She kept moving. Above the mountain, Cole was sitting up. Etta had the bullet wound cleaned and packed before he'd fully understood what she was doing. It had passed through cleanly through the right side, out through the back, missing everything that would have killed him by 2 inches. He'd know that later. Right now he knew that Mara was underground and the wagons were gone, and every minute he sat on Etta's examination table was a minute he couldn't get back. "You move before I say you can, and you'll tear it open," Etta said. "How long?" "An hour. Sit." He sat. Sheriff Boone was in the corner, turning his hat in his hands. June sat on the floor with her satchel open, message strips spread around her in careful order. Tomas Ortega stood near the window with his arms crossed and his face doing something complicated. "The transfer order for Lenora," Boone said. "I checked it against the original Durango wire. It was changed, 3 words altered." He put his hat on the table. "I've been operating on forged documents for 6 months. Vane controls the telegraph office," Cole said. "Every message in and out of Mercy Gap has been his. I know that now. You know it now because Mara told you." Boone accepted that without arguing. Tomas turned from the window. "The ventilation tunnel," he said. "I designed it. I know where the barrier is and how it was sealed." His voice was rough. "I can open it from outside if someone helps me with the iron plate. It takes 2 people." Cole looked at him. "My son's family is in company housing," Tomas said. "You understand why I stayed quiet?" "Yes, that's not an excuse. I'm explaining the cost of it." He picked up his coat from the chair. "Tell me about the second entrance. I'll tell you what I know about the cap." Cole described the northwest face. Tomas listened and nodded. Then he described the cap in detail. 12 bolts, iron plate, positioned above a secondary junction that opened directly into the chamber below. June looked up from her message strips. "I have 17 transmissions that show Vane ordering the mine sealed. Dates, times, his personal relay code." She organized them into a stack and held them out, in case anyone needs evidence. Etta looked at Cole. "1 hour is up," she said. "Try not to bleed on anything important." They rode up in a group: Cole, Boone, Etta, Tomas, and 4 ranch workers Cole had pulled from 2 neighboring spreads, whose owners quietly ignored Vane's freight threat. The snow was deep above the timberline. The horses went as far as the old ore road, and then they went on foot. Cole heard the tapping when they were still 50 yards from the ventilation cap. He stopped the group with one hand. Listened. Morse, coming up through the ground, through the iron pipe, through the snow-covered cap at their feet. Faint, but clear. He crouched and pressed his palm to the snow. Closed his eyes. 41 people in the chamber. Explosives positioned at the main support column. Fuse access from the eastern junction, where Vane's private controls were housed. He pressed his palm harder against the cold and listened to Mara's voice coming up through the mountain in dots and dashes, and counted every person she told him was waiting below. Then the tapping changed pattern, shorter, urgent. He looked at Tomas. "How long to open the cap?" 10 minutes, maybe 12. "Start now." Tomas went to work on the bolts. Two of the ranch workers helped. Boone cleared snow from the plate edges while Etta positioned herself to receive whoever came up first. Cole pressed his ear to the pipe again. The fuse had been lit. He stood and looked at the iron plate and calculated 12 minutes against however long the fuse was, and decided that calculation wasn't useful, and picked up a wrench. They moved faster. Below, Mara heard the bolts turning from outside and felt something in her chest unknot, not relief. Not yet, but the first breath of possibility. Then the plate lifted, and cold air fell into the chamber, and above her she could see stars. Cole's face appeared in the opening. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then she said, "There are 41 people, and we need to move them now." "I know," he said. "Tell me who goes first." The first explosion took out the eastern passage. The blast pushed a wall of hot air through the connecting tunnels and knocked two workers off their feet. But the ventilation shaft held. Tomas had built it to outlast the mine itself, and it did. Cole and one of the ranch hands reinforced the first junction with timber from a collapsed secondary beam, while Mara moved people through in pairs. She put the strongest workers at the front and back of the line. The ones who needed support went in the middle, paired with someone steadier. She'd assigned the pairings 2 hours ago. Everyone knew their partner. No one had to think about it in the dark and the noise. Lenora took the rear. She moved the older workers and the injured with a calm that didn't look like performance because it wasn't. She'd been a teacher long enough to know that panic was contagious, and steadiness was too. And she chose steadiness with the same deliberateness that Mara had chosen to stay underground rather than take the two-person escape route when it first appeared. Mara came out of the ventilation shaft last from the front section. She didn't stop at the surface. She went back in. Cole grabbed her arm. "Where are you going?" "The private telegraph line," she said. "Vane equipment is in the eastern junction. The explosion opened the access wall. I saw it as we were moving people through. The line is live. I can reach it from the secondary passage. The fuse is still burning." "I know where it is, Mara. The transmission I sent from the telegraph office was incomplete," she said. "If I don't finish the record, Vane destroys the local evidence and denies the rest. He'll say the signal was forged. He'll say the workers are drifters." She looked at Cole directly. "You know I'm right." He held her arm for 1 second longer. Then he let go. She went back in. The secondary passage was low and hot and smelled of scorched timber. She moved fast, counting junctions from memory, taking the left branch at the second split, and came out into the eastern room where Vane's private equipment sat in a wooden cabinet against the far wall. The cabinet was locked. She used her bolt wire on the mechanism and had it open in 40 seconds. The line was live. She could feel the current when she touched the receiver. She pulled the mine's internal bell wire from the wall. Thick copper, good conductor, and stripped the ends with her teeth and used the exposed wire to bridge Vane's private relay to the external railway junction connection. A rough splice, the kind that would work for 10 minutes and burn out after. But 10 minutes was what she needed. She began transmitting. She sent the names of the surviving workers first, all 41. Then the date of the original explosion, the false death certificates, the forged federal warrant for Lenora. She sent Vane's private transmission codes, the ones from the missing codebook pages she'd memorized before they were taken. She addressed the transmission to Durango, Silverton, and the Territorial Marshal's office, and repeated the relay code 3 times, so every connected operator would know it was a public emergency record. Outside, June was at the town telegraph office. She'd been there since before the group left for the mountain, sitting in the dark with the receiver pressed to her ear, waiting. When the transmission came through the independent railway junction, she recognized Mara's rhythm immediately, that particular clean interval between characters, no wasted space, no hesitation. She began retransmitting to every line she could reach. Above the mine, Vane emerged from the stamp mill platform with 2 of his guards and a detonator box on a long wire. He was moving toward the main support chamber access when Cole stepped out of the dark in front of him. Vane looked at him, looked at the empty mountain behind him. "The workers are already out," Cole said. Vane didn't lower the detonator. "You can still walk away from this," he said. "You've always been better at walking away." "That's what you've believed for 8 years," Cole said. "You were wrong about it then, too." Vane looked at the guard to his left. The guard found Sheriff Boone's rifle pointed at his chest and reconsidered. "Put the box down," Boone said from behind Vane. Vane set it down slowly. His face was the face of a man recalculating, and the calculation wasn't working. He turned to Cole with something that might have been a last attempt. "The girl is still inside. You want to go get her, or stay out here with me?" Cole had already turned toward the secondary passage entrance. He was almost there when Vane picked the detonator back up. He didn't get to use it. Mara came out of the passage at a low run, and Lenora was right behind her with a mine lever she'd pulled from the last junction wall, and she hit the detonator wire at the connection point, and the circuit broke clean. Vane spun toward them. Cole caught his arm and pinned it, and Boone had the rest of him in 4 seconds, and the mountain went quiet. Tomas, standing near the stamp mill, reached inside the machinery housing and pulled the main drive lever. The mill stopped. The constant grinding that had covered the sound of everything happening in Mercy Gap for years just stopped. In the silence, they could hear voices coming from the mountain. Workers climbing toward the surface, boots on stone and ore gravel, getting louder, coming up through the ventilation exit and into the night air. The people of Mercy Gap heard it too. They'd come up the road in ones and twos after June's transmission started arriving at the town office. Not all of them, some locked their doors and waited to see which way things fell. But enough. Families who'd been told their men died 8 years ago. Men who'd received forged death notices and couldn't prove they hadn't buried a ghost. The first worker to reach the surface was Hector. He stood at the mine entrance and looked down at the town below and breathed cold air. For what he said later was the first time in 3 years that he could breathe without counting the hours until the next shift. Then the others came out behind him, and down in Mercy Gap, a woman named Clara Reyes walked out of the crowd because someone had described a man with a particular scar on his left hand, and she walked forward, and then she walked faster, and then she was running, and Hector came down the slope toward her, and they met in the middle of the road. Mara watched from the mill platform. She was looking for Cole's hat in the crowd, not his face. She'd learned in the past 3 weeks that you could find Cole by looking for the hat first, because he moved quietly, and the hat was dark and distinct, and always where she expected it to be. She found the hat on the ground near the stamp mill, half buried by a fallen timber from the platform edge. Cole was not with it. She moved through the crowd, faster, looking everywhere, and the crowd was loud and people were crying, and the mill was silent, and her mind was very steady in the way it got when she needed it to be, and she told herself that steady and scared could exist at the same time. She circled the stamp mill. Cole was not there. She found him under the mill platform. He was on his back in the snow with one arm pinned under a fallen crossbeam, not unconscious but close. Tomas was beside him, one leg at a bad angle, breathing hard. The beam had come down when Tomas killed the mill drive. The sudden stop had stressed the platform frame, and the oldest timber had given way. Cole looked up when Mara crouched beside him. "Tomas is worse," he said. "I can see that. You're next." Between her and 2 of the ranch workers, they got the beam off Cole's arm and got Tomas onto a board that became a stretcher. Etta appeared from the edge of the crowd and took over with Tomas immediately, her hands moving with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for a night like this for 8 years. Cole sat up. He had a gash on his forearm where the beam had pinned him, and his right side was bleeding again through Etta's earlier bandaging, but he was sitting up, and that was enough for now. He looked at Mara's face. "The transmission," he said. "Sent. June retransmitted from town." Durango, Silverton, the territorial marshal. She was already working on his arm with her scarf. It's done. How many names got through? All 41. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them and looked at the mill platform and the crowd beyond it. And she watched him understand what was happening on the road below. The reunions. The sound of people recognizing each other across years of official absence. He didn't say anything. His jaw moved once and stopped. She tied off the scarf and sat beside him in the snow and let him have the moment. Vane was transported out of Mercy Gap 2 days later under armed guard after 3 outside investigators arrived on the morning train following Mara's transmission. He left the way powerful men sometimes leave places they've built quietly and in the back of someone else's wagon and without anyone stopping to watch. The mining company went under temporary worker supervision. Hector became the elected foreman of the committee that managed the transition. The hidden shaft was closed permanently, the main line made safe. The falsified death records corrected one by one through the county office, with Etta's medical notes as the primary evidence. Tomas's leg healed slowly. He spent his recovery at Etta's surgery, which was where he and Etta discovered that they had a great deal to argue about, and neither of them minded arguing. His son's family kept the company house under the new worker committee's housing authority, which Tomas had lobbied for personally from his recovery bed. Sheriff Boone came to Broken Spur Station on a clear Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands and an apology that had clearly been rehearsed and was more honest for the rehearsal rather than less. "I should have looked at those warrants harder," he said to Cole. "I knew something was wrong. I waited for someone else to say it first." "You acted when it mattered," Cole said. "That's generous. It's accurate. I'd rather have accurate than generous." He put his hand out, and Boone shook it. And that was the end and the beginning of a different arrangement between them. June became Mara's first apprentice 3 days after the rescue, showing up at Broken Spur Station with her message satchel over one shoulder and asking when they were starting. Mara started her that afternoon on basic key technique and had to correct the same error 6 times before June got it right and then never got it wrong again. She was a natural. Mara told her so plainly, which June received with the careful dignity of someone who hadn't been told that kind of thing often enough. Lenora stayed in Mercy Gap. She came to Broken Spur Station on a Sunday, a week after the rescue, when the first real winter snow was falling, the kind that stayed. She sat across from Cole in the kitchen and said what she'd been preparing to say since they carried her out of the hidden chamber. "What I wrote to you in June was true. And it was also incomplete," she said. "I needed your help, and I framed the letters to make you willing to give it." By October, I wasn't framing anything anymore. But the beginning was what it was, and you deserve to know that clearly. "I know," Cole said. "You're not angry." "I was," he said, "for about 2 days. Then I thought about what I would have done if I'd known the truth and believed the workers were still alive." He looked at the table. "I'd have gone up that mountain. She knew that. She bet on it." Lenora was quiet. "She was right," he said. Lenora looked at him steadily. "She's going to convince herself she should leave," she said. "She'll tell herself it's the right thing. That Durango is a better opportunity. That staying means owing you something." She leaned forward slightly. "She's been making herself useful for so long that she's forgotten she's allowed to just choose." Cole looked at the window. Mara was outside in the cold converting the last wall of the unfinished schoolroom, overseeing the installation of a telegraph receiving board with June's help. She had ink on her coat sleeve and was gesturing at the wall, framing, with a hammer in her hand. And June was laughing at something she'd said. "I know what she's allowed," Cole said. The Durango offer arrived in writing 10 days later. A permanent operating position, good salary, office in the new railway station building. It was a better position than anything she'd held before, and she knew it, and the letter sat on the schoolroom workbench for 3 days while she tried to read it neutrally and failed. She came in from the stable on the third evening, and found the schoolroom different. The new telegraph bench was installed. The receiving board was up and wired. The two windows she'd asked to have placed in the south wall were in, and they let in the last of the winter evening light at an angle that fell exactly on the working surface. Her brass key was mounted on the bench where she'd left it, and on the wall above the bench, Cole had framed and mounted the telegraph operator's certification she'd left in the trunk on the first night. Her name, her credentials, centered on the wall of the room. She stood there a long time. Cole came in behind her. He'd been working on the stable repair, and his coat was damp, and he had sawdust on his hat brim. He looked at her standing in the middle of the room. "I built it, without assuming you'd accept it," he said. "The room belongs to you whether you stay, leave, or come back later. That's not a condition. It's just true." She turned around. "The night you came here," he said, "I said I was expecting someone else. I thought that meant you were standing in the wrong place." He stopped. Then he kept going. "I know better now. Lenora was the woman I expected. You are the woman I came to trust. The woman I could not stop loving, and the woman I will never ask to become anybody but herself." Mara looked at him in the lamplight and the late snowlight coming through the new south windows, and thought about all the rooms she'd worked in that belonged to someone else, all the roles she'd filled that were shaped around someone else's absence. She thought about Lenora's hairpin on the pillow and the fence wire ground line and Cole's hand pressed against the snow above the ventilation cap, listening to her voice come up through the mountain. "I asked to stay until you found her," she said. "You found her, Cole." She paused. "The trouble is, somewhere along the way, I found the place I wanted to return to." He found the letter on the bench, picked it up, set it back down. "There's a contract with the Independent Railway Junction," he said. "Regional relay management. The operator works from whatever office they choose as long as the line stays active. I asked about it last week." He met her eyes. "It's based here if you want it. You asked about it before you knew what I'd decide." "Yes. You were going to tell me about it either way." "Yes." She looked at the certification on the wall, her name in the room she was going to fill. She sent the Durango office a professional and courteous declination the following morning. She negotiated the regional relay contract herself through the independent railway line with her own signature. The Broken Spur telegraph and printing office opened on a Thursday in late December, with June sending the first outgoing message and Mara receiving the first incoming one, and Cole watching from the doorway with his arms crossed and his expression doing something he probably thought was neutral. On the first night the office was fully operational, Lenora rode home from town as the light was going. She lifted a hand as she passed the gate, and June waved back from the telegraph room window. Mara lit the lantern in the left window. Cole came and stood beside her at the right window. He looked at the dark glass. He looked at her. "Do we still need two lights?" he said, "now that no one's missing?" She picked up the second lantern and lit it from the first. "One guides travelers toward the station," she said. "The other reminds them someone is waiting inside." She placed it in the right window. Both lanterns burned through the cold and the dark, steady and close, while outside the snow came down on the San Juan Mountains, and the telegraph sounder on the bench began to click with a message coming in from somewhere beyond the range. She sat down at the key and started writing. So that's the story of Mara Vale and Cole Barlow. And before you go, I want to sit with you for just a moment because this story isn't really about a stagecoach crash or a missing woman or a villain who controlled a town through telegraph wires. Those things are the bones. What the story is actually about runs a lot deeper than that. Mara arrived at that ranch knowing she was the wrong person. She said it herself. She wasn't asking for anything that belonged to her sister. She offered her work, her skill, her time, and she kept the door open to leave the moment she was no longer needed. And here's what I want you to think about. How many of us have lived inside that exact arrangement? showing up somewhere, a job, a relationship, a family, and quietly performing usefulness. Because we've learned that being needed is the closest thing to being wanted that we're going to get. Mara spent 32 years being the capable one, the one who handled things. And every time someone praised her for it, what they were really saying was, "We value what you do, not who you are." She'd heard that so many times she'd started to believe it was the same thing. It isn't, and that's the first lesson this story carries. Cole had his own version of the same wound. He'd made a decision 8 years earlier, followed a map he should have questioned, trusted authority he should have challenged, and when it went wrong, he didn't just lose his reputation. He lost his belief that he was allowed to promise anyone a future. Because in his mind, loving someone meant putting them in the path of whatever disaster followed him around. So he kept people at distance and called it protection. He offered Mara an escape route every time he got scared. He withheld information to keep her safe, and every single time, he was making her decisions for her, which is its own kind of control, even when it comes from genuine care. That's the second lesson. There is a difference between protecting someone and deciding for them. Real love, the kind worth having, requires you to trust the other person with the truth, with the risk, with the choice. Cole didn't learn that overnight. It took a mine collapse and a telegraph transmission through iron pipes and a woman who refused to leave an underground chamber full of strangers to finally make him understand that love isn't a rescue operation. You don't get to manage it from a safe distance. And then there's the question the whole story is built around. Can you trust that someone has chosen you freely when the circumstances that brought you together were never entirely clean? Lenora's letters were real and also strategic. Cole's home was prepared for someone else. Mara came west to find her sister, not to fall in love with the man her sister had corresponded with. None of it was simple. None of it was pure. And the story doesn't pretend otherwise, because real life doesn't work that way either. People come to each other through complicated paths. What matters is not how the path started. What matters is the choice made at the end of it, when everything is on the table and nobody is forcing anyone's hand. Mara declined the Durango position. She negotiated her own contract, with her own signature, for her own office, on her own terms. She didn't stay because Cole needed a wife. She didn't stay because Lenora told her to. She stayed because for the first time in her life, she found a place that didn't require her to be smaller than she was. That's not a romantic ending. That's a human one. And those are the ones worth telling. The two lanterns in the window, one to guide travelers in, one to remind them someone is waiting. That image has stayed with me since I first built this story. Because I think most of us are living with only one lantern burning. We're either waiting for someone to arrive, or we've forgotten that we're allowed to let people know we're here. Mara lit both. That's the whole story in a single gesture. So if you take one thing away from Mara and Cole's journey through those Colorado mountains, let it be this. You are not a substitute for the person someone else expected. You are not a temporary arrangement. You are not most valuable when you are most useful. And you are absolutely, completely allowed to choose a life, not the one that needs you, but the one you actually want. That's what the light in both windows means. I hope you carry it with you. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, locations, events, and dialogue are entirely invented for entertainment purposes.